First and foremost, I'd like to thank definitely CSU Stanislaus and of course the Assyrian American Civic Club of Turlock for inviting me to be with you here today. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your Friday afternoons. I know many of you may have skipped lunch to come to this lecture, so I'll try and make it as interesting and as worthwhile as possible. It gives me great pleasure to be with you all today to speak with you about Assyrian continuity and the relevance of preserving Assyrian history and heritage. Even though the Assyrians have been rendered a stateless ethnicity for the past 2,600 years since the fall of the Assyrian Empire, they have managed to survive as a distinct ethnic group and have been resilient in the face of all adversity and stubbornly resisted all those factors which would ultimately lead to their assimilation or extinction thus far. Yet, they have suffered and been victims of countless untold atrocities, including genocide, especially since the main Assyrian genocide which occurred over a century ago, the effects of which continue today. Yet, above all, their story is probably the world's best example of cultural survival over the ages. So, currently a stateless and transnational ethnic group, the Assyrians still inhabit areas of Upper Mesopotamia in countries such as Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Despite the fact that they are largely Christian, their literary traditions are rife with allusions to ancient Mesopotamian culture, and especially to ancient Assyria. Moreover, while most of them speak dialects of Aramaic, their language is heavily infused with Akkadian words, and of course Akkadian was the language the ancient Assyrians spoke during the empire. Among them, the name which they used to identify themselves and their language with. Many of the Assyrians' villages or settlements are also millennia old and are built beside archaeological mounds, and some even have Akkadian names. Many of these facts have been confirmed by research undertaken in recent years, and yet their right to their identity is contested by many scholars who scoff at the faintest notion of continuity. They say, you can't be the Assyrians. You haven't had a state for 2,600 years. The Assyrians are extinct. So, this lecture will focus on certain geographical, cultural and linguistic features of the modern Assyrians, drawing parallels with what we know from ancient Mesopotamia, and providing evidence that the Assyrian identity does live on today. It will also highlight their significance as part of living history that must be maintained, despite having recently become a casualty of war and instability in their Middle Eastern homeland. So, just briefly, the Assyrian homeland is comprised of northern Mesopotamia and the lands around the tributary rivers of the Tigris, such as the Greater and Lesser Zab, especially the area between Lakes Van and Urmia. This land currently encompasses parts of northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, northeast Syria, and northwest Iran. Now, many scholars and anti-Assyrians deny the continuity of the Assyrian identity after the fall of their empire around 612 to 605 BC. Actually, there is plenty of cartographic evidence, on the contrary, proving that there was a geographical area still identified as Assyria by geographers and cartographers the world over and incorporated as provinces in the empires that subsequently ruled over it. Many also think that the Assyrians did not rule any of their own states. This is untrue, since we know that the Assyrians not only served as governors and local rulers under successive empires, but also ruled small kingdoms which served as vassals or client states to the larger empires. Many scholars furthermore insist that Assyrians today do not have the right to claim Assyrian identity, since there was no Assyrian state after the fall of their empire in 609 BC. But this evidence will show that Assyrian identity continued for more than 2.5 centuries afterwards, until the arrival of Islam even. Otherwise, why would these areas still be named Assyria? Now, this is just a map from a website called AssyrianRoots.com, which was developed in Sweden in the last couple of years. And it basically shows not all, but where many Assyrian villages are located. their exact locations. So just corresponds to the map that I was showing before. So the rule of the Median Empire between 605 BC and 550 BC, a total of 55 years, and the Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean Empire between 605 and 539 BC, roughly 66 years, who divided the Assyrian heartland between themselves, were not long enough to destroy the Assyrian identity. They only lasted 2 generations, if so. Under the Persian Achaemenid Empire, which ruled in 530 to 330, or roughly 220 years, Assyria was resurrected as an imperial satrapy, or province, of Arthura. Since Assyria had neither the fabled wealth nor the strategic importance of Babylon, it had been left virtually alone by the Achaemenids, allowing it the space to recollect its own glorious past in a certain tranquility. Under the Achaemenids, the Assyrians were given the right to govern themselves, and Assyrian cities became once more administrative centers. The cities of Nineveh, Nimrud, Ashur were reoccupied and inhabited in this period, and, as mentioned in classical Greek texts of the period, and as mentioned by the Greek mercenary Xenophon in 401 BC, rural Assyria flourished. Assyrian soldiers constituted the main heavy infantry of the Persian military, and they are also mentioned in classical Greek texts of the period. Now, Achaemenid art was also highly influenced by the Assyrians. Thus, we witness them borrowing standard Assyrian imperial motifs, such as the winged bull and the winged disc of the chief deity Ashur, who became Ahura Mazda in the Persian religion. Indeed, not only were Assyrians employed in the construction and decoration of the imperial palace at Persepolis, but they are also depicted as bearing tribute to the Persian emperor in reliefs that adorn its walls. Moreover, Aramaic continued to be used as an imperial and diplomatic language, and the Assyrian judicial system, calendar, and imperial standards were all used by the Achaemenids. Therefore, not much changed, both visually and administratively, to warrant the extinction of Assyrians in this period, since their culture was being carried on by the Persians. If anything, they were right at home due to the Achaemenid perception of themselves as heirs and successors of the Assyrian Empire. In the beginning, however, the Assyrians did rebel against their rule, and 2 Assyrian revolts are recorded as occurring in 546 and 520 BC, both within a century of the fall of their empire. So they were obviously not dead and not extinct. So here you can see, for example, the motif of the winged bulls, where the location of Arthura was, and the relief of the Assyrians bearing tribute to the Persian emperor, which is actually at Persepolis, and the winged disc of the god Ashur. This was continued under the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great, which ruled Assyria between 330 and 323 BC, only 7 years, and its successor, the Seleucid Empire, which ruled the area for 171 years, and was often seen as the successor of the Assyrian Empire. And obviously this is during an era where in Greek the names Assyria and Syria were synonymous with each other, and I'm going to come back to that. Even actually in certain Jewish texts, I think the Jewish texts that mention the Hanukkah story, they identify the Seleucids as Ashurim, or Assyrians. Now, under the Parthian Empire, in 141 to 224 AD, 141 BC to 224 AD, a total of 365 years, the Assyrians developed Aramaic-speaking vassal kingdoms around the cities of Arbel, or Adiaben, Hatra, in the kingdom of Araba, and Edessa, in the kingdom of Osroene, which were used as buffers in the frontier with the Roman Empire and were eventually absorbed into these empires. Now, in the map, I've actually noted that Hatra is very close to the first ever Assyrian capital at Ashur, and Arbil is very close to the later Assyrian capital at Nineveh, and then again Edessa is at the last recorded Assyrian capital city, which was Haran. Now, the kingdom of Edessa, or Osroene, for instance, was at times semi-autonomous, at others completely independent, and was wedged in between the Roman and Parthian empires. It existed for more than 4 centuries, between 137 BC and 244 AD, and was ruled by a total of 28 kings, who produced their own coinage even. And you can see a photograph of Edessa on the left. And the photo in the center is of the shorter-lived kingdom of Hatra, which existed between the 1st century AD and 241 AD, and was based at a caravan city now in the desert between the Assyrian cities of Mosul and Tikrit. The client kingdom of Adiabene, on the other hand, was a vassal state of the Armenian kingdom, the Parthian Empire, and the Sasanian Empire later on, and it later became the Sasanian province of Notshirakan. Adiabene's capital was the ancient Assyrian town of Arba Ilu, the city of the 4 gods, present-day Erbil, and its inhabitants were Assyrians. Now on the right you can see an image of the castle of Erbil. And here you can see in greater detail where these kingdoms were in the scope of things. The red obviously being the Roman, later the Byzantine Empire, and then the brown/orange area being the Parthian Empire. Now, during this time, the temple of Ashur in the first Assyrian royal capital was restored and in use. Dated Aramaic inscriptions have been found here from between 12 and 238 AD. In them, we find the names of deities worshipped which were identical to those of the imperial Assyrian period. And this is significant because it's more than 600 to 800 years after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. So in them we find the names of gods such as Nabu, Nergal, Adad, and Shamash. At the head of the Assyrian pantheon was the Assyrian Holy Trinity, consisting of Ashur, pronounced Asur, also known as Bel, our Lord, the Master of the House, the Lord of the Gods, the King, or quite simply, God. His consort, Ishtar, also known as Sherewa or Nanai, the Lady, our Lady, His Lady, or the Queen. And Tammuz, also known as the Son of our Lords and the Son of God. The same deities are also found in Aramaic inscriptions from the city of Hatra. In the early 1st century AD, the royal family of Adiabene converted to Judaism. And this is said to have been an important step in the eventual spread of Christianity throughout that area. Now, after the kingdom's royal family was abolished, the province retained its significance as being under the sole jurisdiction of the Sasanian crown prince, who governed it exclusively prior to ascending the imperial throne. And that was some sort of prestige. Later on, Adiabene became an important metropolitan see of the Church of the East, with jurisdiction over all of historical Assyria. It is believed, now let me just move on. Now here you can see, for example, a floor plan of the rebuilt Ashur temple in the city of Ashur, and this is it's an image of the ruler of Ashur from 12 AD, and I'm going to show a better picture of that, but it sort of shows the Aramaic inscription next to his head. There's a more full picture, and you can see the continuity of the motif, okay? So on the left you have the stele of Adad Nirari III, who was an Assyrian emperor that lived around 800 BC. And this is the stele of Rahat Asur, who was the Maria, or the governor of Asur, who lived in 12 AD, more than 800 years later. And you can see in terms of posture, in terms of symbolism, in terms of iconography, even in terms of the shape of the stele, and the stance of the feet, they're almost exactly the same. And this is some sort of continuity, if anything. Now, it is believed that the modern Assyrian identity, language, and culture developed during this period and the preceding Seleucid period, and was actually crystallized during this Parthian period. Indeed, many features of the pre-modern and modern Assyrian communities date back to this time in history. Among them, the calendar and dating system of the Greeks, which began in 311 BC, the greater Syrian identity, and the Syriac language, the first example of which dates to 6 AD, and this is an image of the very first Syriac inscription from 6 AD, as well as modern Assyrian costume, which uncannily resembles that of Adiabene and Hatra from the Parthian period. Now on the left, you have a relief from Assur, from the 1st or 2nd century AD, and on the right you have the costume of an Assyrian man from the Hakkari highlands. Very similar. And here, for example, on the left, you have the costume of an Assyrian woman from the Nineveh plain, from the village of Tiscopa. On the right, you have a statue of a princess from the city of Hatra. The headgear, we call it a qabaya, the thing that looks like a blanket that she's wearing on top of her clothes. It's almost exactly the same. And finally, an image of the sarcophagus of the Assyrian queen of Arbil, whose name was Helena or Sadan, who converted to Judaism. And this sarcophagus was actually found in Jerusalem. And there's an image of the inscription there, the inscription that was on the sarcophagus, and it reads Sadan Malikta in Estrangela, in Syriac Estrangela letters. Now, both Assyria and Mesopotamia were incorporated as provinces of the Roman Empire under Trajan between 116 and 118 AD. It was only a period of 2 years. And under the Sasanian Empire, between 224 and 637 AD, or for a period of 413 years, the name Asuristan or Asuristan, Assyria, was given to the Mesopotamian province around the imperial capital Ctesiphon. This name is a compound of Asur, Assyria, and the Iranian suffix estan or land of. Nevertheless, the geographical term was largely identical with ancient Mesopotamia, originally encompassing both ancient heartlands of Assyria and Babylonia, but eventually shifting to refer more frequently to Babylonia itself. In Syriac, this area was referred to as Beth Armaye, or land of the Arameans, since the majority of its inhabitants were Aramaic speakers. And Aramaic, in turn, greatly influenced the Middle Persian or Pahlavi language of the Sassanids. It was here that the Patriarchate of the Church of the East was established in the early centuries of Christianity, and there it remained until its transfer to the newly built Islamic capital of Baghdad in 765 AD. So here you can see a map showing the location of Asuristan and Adiabene, and again Asuristan, and an image of what remains of the imperial capital of Ctesiphon. Now, during this time, the old Mesopotamian religion remained strong. Pagan temples were still being dedicated to Ashur, Shamash, Ishtar, Sin, Adad, and Nergal, or Ninurta, in Ashur, Arbela, and Haran, among other places. And the images you see here are from a site called Soghmatar, which is just to the east of Edessa. And these are from the 3rd to 4th centuries AD. We also have evidence for the celebration of the Assyrian New Year or Akitu festival in Edessa at the same period, and this is mentioned in the martyrdom of Saint Charbel of Edessa, who was martyred in 107 AD. Traces of this pagan Assyrian religion would survive as late as the 10th century in the remote parts of Assyria, such as the city of Haran, and the Assyrian New Year festival continued to be celebrated in areas with large Assyrian concentrations, such as the Turabdin Plateau and the Hakkari highlands. Furthermore, Assyria appears in the contemporary geographies, histories, and world maps of Hecataeus of Miletus, so roughly 5th to 6th century BC, Herodotus, 5th century BC, and these are all after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. Eratosthenes of Cyrene in the 2nd to 3rd century BC. Strabo in the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. Pomponius Mela in the 1st century AD. And Claudius Ptolemy of Alexandria in the 1st to 2nd centuries AD. And these, as I said, are centuries after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. Strabo, in fact, lists several of the traditional cities, including Ninus, or Nineveh, and Kalachene, or Kalhu, Nimrod, in the Assyrian heartland, which he calls Arturia. He writes that when those who have written histories about the Syrian Empire say that the Medes were overthrown by the Persians and the Syrians by the Medes, they mean by the Syrians no other people than those who built the royal palaces in Babylon and Ninus. And of these Syrians, Ninus was the man who founded Ninus in Arturia, and his wife, Semiramis, or Shamiram, was the woman who succeeded her husband. Now, the city of Ninus was wiped out immediately after the overthrow of the Syrians, and it was much greater than Babylon and was situated in the plain of Arturia. Now, Strabo has an extensive section in his geography regarding the Assyrian heartland, and this is just one small part of it. With the development of Christianity and the spread of the Church of the East, Assyria remained as the name of an ecclesiastical province, and here you can see Arthur. Okay? And it was a major metropolitan archdiocese of the Church, which lasted from 410 AD until 1813. So roughly 1,600 years. According to Patricia Crone, Christianity in Assyria was a way of sanctifying a provincial identity, and she calls the local Church of Assyria a chauvinist assertion of this identity. Its first centers, and this is a map basically showing the main bishops' locations, bishop sees within the Archdiocese of Assyria, or Arthur, or Adiabene, and as you can see, it extended all the way into the Urmia region of Iran. So its first centers were at Arbel and Haza in Adiabene, which had a bishop since 104 AD. And its see was moved to Mosul, also known as Arthur or Assyria, in around 780. In 1210, Mosul and Arbel became separate metropolitan archdioceses, with the latter persisting until its absorption into the Chaldean Catholic Church after 1789, and the former persisting until its absorption into the Chaldean Catholic Church in 1813. At the same time, Assyria and Assyrians appear in maps of the Middle East created by Europeans between the 16th and 19th centuries. So, for example, this is a map of the Persian Empire from the 1500s, and obviously I've got it sort of boxed in and underlined where it says Assyria. And a map of the Turkish Empire from 1626, where they have images of the inhabitants of the empire, including an Assyrian and his wife, you know, and some other maps as well from around the same period. Now, the Assyrian identity geographically and even culturally appears to have been continuous in the same area for a total of nearly 2.5 millennia. It never went away, even though the Arabs and Kurds gradually became the dominant ethnic group in the area, and some Assyrians changed their sects and their names to those of other peoples and geographical areas. If there were no Assyrian people living in those areas with no Assyrian identity, in all of those time periods, all of this recurrent usage of the geographical term Assyria would have been impossible. It would have been impossible. So now I'm going to move on to Assyria in Syriac sources, okay? After the conversion of most Assyrians to Christianity in the first centuries in which the religion spread, their literary language became known as Syriac, or the language of Greater Syria, or Assyria. In Syriac sources written during the late Antique period and the Middle Ages, we find many references to the Assyrians, as well as ones equating the words Syriac and Assyrian, Suriaya and Aturaya, with one another. One of the earliest of these texts, the Doctrine of Saint Addai the Apostle, from around 400, clearly mentions Narsai, king of the Assyrians, as one of those who converted to Christianity through his teachings. The Acts of Saint Mari, Apostle of Mesopotamia, from the 5th century, calls the northern part of that area of Mesopotamia between Edessa and Seleucia Ctesiphon the country of the Suriae, or Syriacs, and includes references to ancient Mesopotamian practices such as the communal assembly, or pukhra, from the Akkadian word pukhru. According to the 6th century history of the martyrs of Beth Sluch, or Kirkuk, the city was founded by the Assyrian ruler Sardana, and after Sargon built a palace there, it was later called Karkhat Sargon, or the citadel of Sargon. According to Patricia Crone, again, author of Hagarism, the history of Karkhat Bet Sluch begins with the Assyrian kings and ends with the Assyrian martyrs. Sargon founded it, and the martyrs made it a blessed field for Christianity. Likewise, in the 7th century before Christ, all the world stood in awe of Sardana, and in the 7th century after Christ, the saints took his place as the son of Ator and the glory of Nineveh. Also popular in Syriac literature are the story and proverbs of Ahiqar the Wise, an Aramean sage at the court of the Assyrian king, of the Assyrian kings Sennacherib and Sardana, or Sardanapalus, or Esarhaddon. According to Syriac texts, this very king Sardana, 32nd king of Assyria after Belos and ruler of a third of the inhabited world, submitted to the monotheistic message of the prophet Jonah and instituted the Ninevite fast, which saved Nineveh from destruction. This fast, having saved the Assyrians from the wrath of God in the past, was reinstituted later by the metropolitan Saurisho of Kirkuk to save them from a plague 1,000 years later. Indeed, this fast is still kept in the Church of the East, as well as the Chaldean Catholic, Syriac Orthodox and Syriac Catholic churches. In other words, the Assyrians were monotheists before Christ and Christians subsequently after him. And the past therefore led on to the present without a break. There are additionally saints revered in Syriac Christianity in whose hagiographies or life stories are clearly said to be descended from Assyrian royalty. Among them are Saint Behnam and his sister Sarah, who died in 350, who were the children of a local ruler or governor named Sennacherib. The warrior Saint Qardach, a 4th century governor of Erbil, whose father was a descendant of Sennacherib and whose mother was a descendant of Nimrod, and whose name actually derives from the Akkadian word meaning hero or warrior. And also Saint Zena, bishop of Beth Raman, and his sister Sarah, who died in 629 AD, from the town of Beth Waziq. And this basically shows you the area in which they lived. So the red areas, the areas marked in red, are those associated with these three saints, and the black are the main ancient Assyrian cities in the area, and then the blue are modern Assyrian settlements, or where Assyrians live today. So you can see that they're intertwined with this geography of being Assyrian, and that this even shows up in Syriac texts from the Christian period. Oh, this was what I was looking for. I misplaced it. So this is an image of Ahiqar, who was the sage at the Assyrian court of Sennacherib and Esarhaddon, who shows up in Syriac texts. And this is an actual Syriac/Arabic manuscript. You can see the names here are in Syriac, and then around them it's written in Arabic. And it shows the main philosophers that were idolized in Syriac literature. So you have the staple Greek philosophers, Plato, Galen, and Aristotle, and you have Ahiqar Hakima. Now, among the church fathers, we find Tatian the Assyrian, who wrote in Greek during the 2nd century and was proud to have been born in the land of the Assyrians. Also, Lucian of Samosata, who lived during the same period, also identified himself as an Assyrian. Assyrians again feature prominently in the writings of St. Ephraim Cyrus, Syriac Orthodox Patriarch Dionysius of Telmahre, and Syriac Orthodox Catholicos Gregory Bar Hebraeus, as well as 13th century Church of the East theologian and poet Georgis Warda of Erbil, who writes of the Assyrians during his time as a living ethnicity and not as an extinct bygone empire. Among his writings, he says, "Our Lord, heed the rogation of the Babylonians and Assyrians, now that church leadership is in disarray. Our Lord, heed the request of our destitute country. I glorify your godliness and ask for your forgiveness." He also wrote a lengthy homily on the patriarchs of the Church of the East, faithfully identifying among them those who were of Assyrian ethnicity. The 12th century Syriac Orthodox Patriarch Michael the Great, in his chronography, mentions the following: that even if their name is Syrian, they are originally Assyrians, and they have had many honorable kings. Syria is in the west of the Euphrates, and its inhabitants, who are talking our Aramaic language and who are so-called Syrians, are only part of the whole, while the other part, which was in the east of the Euphrates going to Persia, had many kings from Assyria and Babylon and Edessa. Assyrians, who were called Syrians by the Greeks, were also the same Assyrians, Assyrians from Assur, who built the city of Nineveh. And just some snippets from his chronography. So here he's got the passage where he's talking about ancient communities that were literate or that have possessed literature, and he says, Athurayed Hennun Suriaye. So the Assyrians, who are the Syriacs. So they're exactly the same people. And this longer quote is the one that I just mentioned, and in it he actually talks about Assur, who was the father of the Assuraye. And I'm going to come to this Assuraye later on in the talk. Indeed, we find such references to Assyrian ancestry and identity among Christians from Syriac churches as late as 1844. So I'm going to skip by 500 years, when British missionary and explorer Horatio Southgate visited the community at Kharput in modern-day Turkey. There, the Syriac Orthodox Christians clearly identified themselves as Assyrians and the sons of Ashur. So it says that right here. I observed that the Armenians did not know them under the name which I used, Syriani, but called them Asuri, which struck me the more at the moment from its resemblance to our English name Assyrians, from whom they claim their origin, being sons, as they say, of Ashur, who went out of the land of Shinar and built Nineveh, etc. So we see that in Kharput, the Syriac Orthodox Christians clearly identified themselves as Assyrians and the sons of Ashur prior to the excavations at Nineveh, Nimrud and Khorsabad, over 360 miles away, and decades before the development of Assyrian nationalism. So, I'm just going to move on to a little bit about linguistic continuity. The language spoken by Assyrians today is classified as Northeastern Neo-Aramaic, and I'm going to go through that on a map with you. Now, the northeast of this Aramaic-speaking area generally refers to northern Mesopotamia or Assyria. Hence, this is, in all reality, Assyrian Neo-Aramaic. Now, the switch from Akkadian to Aramaic within the Assyrian Empire had already begun in the 8th century BC, when it was made the second official language of the realm. Despite that, modern Assyrian Aramaic retains an Akkadian flavor, especially in the form of Akkadian vocabulary, largely in regards to agriculture. Examples include words such as bakhshime, or grain storeroom, rakhisa, a pile of straw, Msharra, a rice paddy, and the word Billa, meaning gate. Month names in the vernacular dialects are also closer to Akkadian than to classical Syriac. For example, Ilun for September rather than Ilul, which is what we find in Syriac. Additionally, Tabbakh, the name for August, is also believed to derive from Akkadian. Finally, we find many similarities with Akkadian pronunciation in various dialects of modern Assyrian. So among them, the fact that He is often silent or assimilated, Hath is pronounced as Kheth, Ayn is turned into a glottal stop, or it's assimilated so it's not pronounced, shifts between the dentals, the labials, the palatovertals and the sibilants, and other features, especially in the pronunciation of certain words which are closer to Akkadian than to Aramaic, even though they're cognate words. So here we find a map of Christian and Jewish Aramaic dialects from northern Mesopotamia. Yes, and I'm sorry, the map is in Russian. Russians make very good maps. Okay. You can basically see this is like Urmia here. We're looking at the border of Iran and Iraq. We've got Syria here, Turkey there. And you can see where these dialects are from. They're basically from the Assyrian heartland. They're from northern Mesopotamia. Again, another Russian map. So the green shaded area is the area where Aramaic was commonly spoken. And the dark green circles represent the main schools of learning during the Christian period. And here you have the border between the Byzantine and the Sasanian empires. So if you look at the northeast of this area, okay, this is the east, that's the northeast. Northeastern Neo-Aramaic is from Assyria. It can't be from anywhere else. So the fact that the language that modern Assyrians speak is classified as Northeastern Aramaic means that it is Assyrian Aramaic. Again, another map. I like maps very much. In this map, I want you to compare the extent of the Assyrian Empire in 700 BC with the extent of the Aramaic-speaking area in the Middle East during late antiquity, and it's almost exactly the same. Because the Assyrians had made Aramaic the second official language of the empire, Aramaic became an Assyrian language, and therefore they gave it the status that it later had of being a lingua franca and an international language of trade and diplomacy. So moving on to the survival of the Assyrian identity and name. I think I'll just ask, how am I going for time? Keep going? Okay. No one's bored? Now again, many scholars and anti-Assyrians deny the continuity of the Assyrian name after the fall of their empire. Actually, the Assyrian identity and name never went out of use. The Assyrian national and linguistic identities have survived until today, without an independent state, for over 2,600 years, even though many of those who have continued using these identities may not fully agree. Assyrians do not just associate themselves with some ancient empire. In their own particular dialects, all Aramaic-speaking Christians that originate from northern Mesopotamia, from Turabdin in Turkey to Urmia in Iran, and from Van in Turkey to Kirkuk in Iraq, whom we would identify as being Assyrians today, irrespective of religious affiliation, designate themselves as, depending on the dialect, Suraye or Suroye, and their language as Surit or Surath or Suret. In addition to the common literary name, Suryaya, Suryoyo. These are names that were historically used by mostly illiterate people with no educations, of all ages and of all Christian sects and denominations, to identify themselves and their language. Hence they were autonyms or endonyms. These words derive from the more ancient designations Assurayi, Assyrians, and Assuritum, Assyrian language, in Akkadian. Despite the fact that non-Assyrian scholars have translated the words incorrectly as Syrian or Syriac, and many of those who use these names have since come to equate them with being Christian. Usually, these are people from isolated communities, far from other Christian groups, such as the Armenians, and they also call Muslims either Kurds or Arabs. In Arabic, the Assyrians are often referred to as Suryan, which is derived from the Persian term Asuriyan, or Assyrians, which has also been inaccurately interpreted as meaning Syrians or Syriacs. Now, indeed, the very term Syria, which I touched upon before, has been well established as a synonym of Assyria, first by the late Professor Richard Nelson Fry, and this has been corroborated with Akkadian evidence by Professor Simo Parpola from Finland. More interesting, however, is a bilingual inscription from the 8th century excavated at the site of Çineköy in southern Turkey. The parallel texts of the inscription, published by Professor Robert Rollinger, are in Phoenician and Luwian, with the former language referring to the Assyrian monarch as the king of Ashur, and the latter referring to him as the king of Sur. Ashuraye, Suraye. So, just another look at the development of the name Suraya. Okay, you have the original term Ashurayu, which later shifted to Asurayu in the Neo-Assyrian period, and which dropped the A and later became Surayu or Suraya. Again, you have Lishanum Ashuritum, which then became Asuritum, Suritum, Surat. You also have the etymology of it probably coming from Athuraya, which later changed to Asuraya and then Suraya. Of course, the sibilants or the sounds are interchangeable between th, sh, s, and t, and we see it in various dialects of the modern Assyrian language. The word for house, okay, some people say Betha, some people say Beta, some people say Besha, and some people say Besa, and it's all the same word. It's just one letter where the sound changes depending on the dialect. And even between the various Semitic languages, so for example, the word for bull in Aramaic is Taura, in Arabic is Thor, and in Hebrew is Shor. So it's very common linguistically. Also, this is something that's puzzled me for a long time. The Neo-Aramaic word surit is an adjectival form of feminine gender. However, the Neo-Aramaic word for language, which surat should be describing, is masculine, and they don't agree. In Assyrian, everything has to agree. If a noun is masculine, the adjective that describes it has to be masculine. It can't be feminine. So I decided to look at related languages, or cognate languages. In Arabic, the word lisan, or tongue, is masculine in gender, except for when it's used in reference to languages. In Hebrew, the word lashon is almost always feminine, and in Akkadian, or ancient Assyrian and Babylonian, lishanu is always feminine in gender. Why it's interesting is because the ancient Assyrians often called their language Asuritu or Asuraitu, Assyrian, in agreement with the gender of the word lishanu, or language. So here you see, from the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, the word lishanu is feminine, and it's used to refer to Ashuraitu, speaking Assyrian. And again, Ashuru, Ashuritu, Ashuraitu refers to the language spoken by the ancient Assyrians. So the fact that the word surat comes from Ashuritu or Asuritu is not so far-fetched. Now, one of the first times in which the word Suraya in particular was shown to be a development of the word Asurayu comes from the Chaldean Arabic Dictionary of Bishop Jacques Eugene Manna, published at Mosul in 1900, page 487. Suraya, he says, means Syriac, Aramaic, Christian. Suryani, Arami, Nasrani. An abbreviation, he says, of Asuraya, which means Athuraya, Assyrian. Manna was a Chaldean Catholic bishop of Van in Turkey, and he hailed from the village of Bakopa in the Nineveh plain, which is now abandoned and on the ISIL front lines. In the introduction of another Chaldean dictionary published at Mosul 3 years earlier in 1897, called The Treasury of the Syriac Language, Archbishop Thomas Odo openly states in his introduction that the word Suriaye is a later development of Aturaye, or Assyrians. And Odo was a Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of Urmia in Iran, and he was from the village of Al-Qush, which is also in the Nineveh plain. Now I'm going to come to exonyms. And the name Suraya is additionally close to what the Assyrians are called by their Persian, Armenian, and Georgian neighbors. Asuri, Asuri, and Asureli, respectively, as well as close to what Arabs and Turks call them, Suryani, which I said is from the Middle Persian word Asurian. Armenians, who have especially lived with Assyrian or Syriac Christians for centuries in countries such as Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey, make no distinction between sectarian identities and thus call all these people by the name Asuri, or Assyrian, which denotes an ethnic Assyrian as opposed to the word Asorestansi, which rather denotes the citizen or inhabitant of a hypothetical Assyrian state. Just as in Armenian they have Hai and Hayastansi, an Armenian and the citizen of Armenia. In contrast, the names Aturaya or Ashuri are preferred by nationalists because of their more direct connotations with the ancient Assyrians and as an archaism or return to the roots of the word, which were readopted and popularized after the development of the nationalist movement in the early 20th century. So now I'm going to talk a little bit, coming towards the end of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about Assyrian continuity in a more geographical context, a more concrete context. Unsurprisingly, many names of towns and villages where modern Assyrians reside can be found in ancient Assyrian texts, demonstrating that they may have been continuously inhabited since that period. Often, if such toponyms are not derived from Akkadian, then their etymology is usually from Syriac or Aramaic. So here you can see, for example, the names of Assyrian villages which come from Akkadian. So you have Qardu, which is a mountain in southeastern Turkey, which comes from the ancient Akkadian word meaning brave or heroic. You have many villages, at least 8 places, called Bitkari, which was a place for the collection of taxes in a trading colony. The city of Mardin in Turkey is mentioned in Akkadian texts. Amid or Diyarbakir, Arbil, of course, Nineveh, Midyat, Karamles, which is a Chaldean Catholic village in the Nineveh plains, shows up in texts as Karmulisi, which means the fortress of Mulisi, which was a name for the wife of the god Ashur, etc. A number of Assyrian villages and settlements can furthermore be found not only near archaeological mounds or tells within which are buried ancient Assyrian villages and towns, but many are also home to important archaeological sites, most notably Assyrian rock carvings. Now, this is a rudimentary list of some Assyrian villages in which there are archaeological mounds, and here you might see it a bit more. So on the top left, you have the monastery of St. George just outside of Mosul, which was destroyed by ISIS, and you can see that it's actually built on an archaeological mound. On the top right, you have Karmulisi. This is the site of Karmulisi, and you've got the Church of Saint Barbara, which is actually built in the mound. And then you have a lot of Assyrian cemeteries that are built on these archaeological mounds. And this particular archaeological mound is right outside the Chaldean Catholic Church in the town of Ankawa, which is a suburb of Erbil now. Again, archaeological sites. At the top you have the series of rock carvings just above the Assyrian village of Maltai to the east of Duhok in northern Iraq. And here you see the site of Shero Maliktha, which is named after the wife of the Assyrian, the head of the Assyrian pantheon. Shero was the name of the wife of the god Ashur. Shero Maliktha means Shero, the queen, and this is just to the west of the village of Al-Qush in the area called Bandawaya. And of course, you have the rock carvings at Khinis, which is also in northern Iraq. Now this is significant, and actually the one at Maltaya as well, you can see there's like a little cave there, and I'm going to mention that in some cases these rock carvings were reused again by Christian monks, in which they carved their hermit cells centuries afterwards. This again exhibits a high level of cultural and geographical continuity in a similar way to that in which the Acropolis in Athens had been converted into a cathedral during the Middle Ages. So the same sacred sites of antiquity became the sacred sites of the Christian period. Now, while the Assyrians' right to their identity is contested by many scholars who scoff at the faintest notion of continuity, as I mentioned earlier, the historical record, geographical context, and linguistic evidence all support this, and I have not even mentioned DNA studies and DNA testing. It has thus been demonstrated that the name Assyria survived as a geographical term after the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC, continuing at least until the 19th and 20th centuries. Assyrian motifs and stories have formed an integral part of Syriac Christian religious and historical literature, and people of Assyrian ethnicity are mentioned throughout these texts. The Aramaic language used by the Assyrian Empire has survived in this same geographical area from the 8th century BC until today, with today's spoken language exhibiting more Akkadian influences than any other Aramaic dialect. Variations of the name Assyrian have continued to be used as ethnic and linguistic markers by the speakers of this language. So these are their endonyms, as well as their neighbors, or the exonyms. And finally, many Assyrian villages and towns continue to bear Akkadian names or are built beside ancient Assyrian archaeological remains, demonstrating some sort of continuity, if anything. So, the modern Assyrians have existed as a stateless ethnic group for over 2,600 years since the fall of their empire. Their survival without a state apparatus to maintain their identity, whether this is a coincidence or not, is something which the world needs to recognize and fully appreciate. This demonstrates that they are a resilient people with a will to survive, and their current struggle, as they are faced with a number of existential threats, is one of existence or non-existence. Above all, they are a significant part of living history that must be maintained and preserved both through scholarship as well as the implementation of concrete cultural and other projects at the grassroots level. Despite the numerous adversities and odds stacked against them, both in their Middle Eastern homeland and the diaspora, and here you can see images showing how Assyrians, because of the fact that most of them are Christian, have been attacked and driven out of their Middle Eastern homeland in a targeted campaign, we could say, since 2003, whether it be in Iraq, and especially we saw this with the ISIL invasion of Mosul and the Nineveh Plain 2 years ago, the destruction of cultural heritage, the burning of manuscripts and libraries, and of course the destruction and the mayhem in Syria since the civil war broke out there 6 years ago or 5 years ago. Now, despite the numerous adversities and odds stacked against them, both in their Middle Eastern homeland and the diaspora, I am positive that the Assyrians will find a new way through which they can continue to survive as a distinct group with their own ethnic identity and preserve their language and heritage as they already have for another 2,600 years. With a history as long and as rich as theirs, why would they not? Thank you very much.